Hey AP Comp, it's Mrs. Donahue, looking tremendous in the classroom that is dark and weird, and one of the plexiglass barriers is beginning to fall down. It's okay, we're all going to be fine. I wanted to make you a small video reviewing the Cesar Chavez annotations on Classroom. You've had them to look at. And I like occasionally in the beginning of the year to start by giving you less and seeing how you receive the new material. So in the past, whenever you've read something, you're looking at literary analysis. So like you read a book and someone has a nightmare about a yellow bird and you wax poetic about the deep symbolic meaning of birds and how they represent freedom and flying, and yellow is the color of cowardice, and you go into all these weird abstract concepts. Literary analysis, that's amazing. Literary analysis is great because that's what you do. You find weird things that you attribute meaning to in books. I love doing that, but it's not the task we have in front of us. We are rhetorical analysis people, which means that you're not necessarily looking at the meaning of something like that, but the structure of it. Why would something be structured this way? And what is the central argument the text is making that this writing structure supports? If you go down through Classroom, you'll notice you do have some partial annotations for In Cold Blood. We're going to get to In Cold Blood as well. But I want to start with the annotated Chavez practice. So that's under the SGO section. In the beginning, there's always the directions at the top of the rhetorical analysis, so it gives minor historical background. In this case, it says on the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., labor union organizer and civil rights leader Cesar Chavez published an article in a magazine of a religious organization devoted to helping those in need. According to AP, everything you need to know about Chavez is right there. So if you have no idea who he is, it told you generally a time period. You don't need to be precise on that time period. You don't have to know the date Martin Luther King was assassinated to know 10 years later what the date was. You don't even need to know where Chavez is from. He is writing into a magazine, so he's writing an article. I sometimes refer to this as a speech because it sounds very speechy, but I would get dinged on AP if I wrote that it was a speech when it was an article. And he's writing in the magazine of a religious organization, so any references he makes inside the body of the text that relate to religious magazines you could use. Other than that, the task is to, in a well-written essay, analyze the rhetorical choices Chavez makes to develop his argument about nonviolent resistance. You must, to have a thesis statement, say what his point about nonviolent resistance is. If you say something else like, he's attributing stuff to Martin Luther King or whatever, you are not fulfilling the task of thesis. It doesn't have to be particularly complex. You could say, Chavez uses word choice repetition and ethos to bolster his argument that nonviolent resistance is the superior path. Boom, thesis. The last sentence there is your directive. If you are in any way off that directive, you are getting less points because the essay's off topic. The big problem students usually have here is that they're going into literary analysis as opposed to rhetorical analysis. So one of the things that you should see is that I went through the essay and I underlined the word nonviolence every time it appeared. Did I do this on the first read through? No. Small, tiny, weird thing. If you are a fast reader, and there's an if there, because you're going to have to learn what the most efficient way for you to annotate text is. If you are a fast reader, you should read through the whole thing once. The reason you should read through the whole thing once is that some rhetorical devices are like grand structure issues. Like they might bookend things in the first and last paragraph, creating this like kind of wraparound structure. That might be really useful, but also you can't get the full impact of knowing if words or phrases or images are repeated in a text until you've read the whole text and can kind of reflect on, wait, he said nonviolence like 1,000 times. It's not a long piece of writing for nonviolence to appear as many times as it appears. So you needed to recognize that word choice and repetition occurred there. You might not have been able to do that if you started annotating on your first read through, because you're too busy both figuring out what's happening and trying to identify the important things. If you're a really slow reader, you might have to learn how to read and annotate at the same time, but it's less efficient than one fast read through and then going through and annotating. So it starts by referencing Dr. King. While yes, you could hit Dr. King as an allusion, reference, historical reference, and while yes, Dr. King bolsters ethos, I would warn you on getting too obsessed with him. It's easy for students to get lost in the rabbit hole of over talking about Martin Luther King Jr. because you know him well. We really don't care that much about him in the context of this essay and its rhetorical devices. So you'll notice that I didn't necessarily hit on that. My response would not focus on it much. The first thing that I really do is I look at nonviolence, and then I basically say the sum up of Dr. King's purpose in this essay is ethos. Ethos. Martin Luther King, it says MLK there, gives credibility to farm workers. Should say farm workers movement or something. In other words, the two movements have symbolic meaning attached to one another. It gives credibility to Chavez to reference this. Of pathos, ethos, and logos, the essay overwhelmingly has more ethos than it does the other two. Not that there's not examples of pathos or examples of logos, but it's not true that all three uniformly exist in the same amounts. They don't have to, and they don't. It's mostly about credibility here. So if you missed that and you said it's mostly a pathos piece or it's mostly a logos piece, either you confused logos and ethos and knowing which one was which happens, or you simply attributed different things to pathos or logos that were better attributed to other devices. I'll explain, don't worry. So if the problem was when you looked at this, you confused ethos and logos, here's the answer. If you explained the function of the device, like if you said King builds credibility for Chavez's argument, even if you called that logos, AP would see it and hear they knew it built credibility. So you'd get a slight hit on misidentifying the correct device, but overwhelmingly you'd get credit for knowing that it was about credibility. So it's better than nothing. You'll see I went through and looked at nonviolence every time. The next big annotation on the right there said it's repeated throughout the text. This constantly reminds you of the purpose, right? We want to reinforce nonviolent resistance, nonviolent resistance, nonviolent resistance, nonviolent resistance. There's something else that goes with that. Word choice and associations with nonviolence. So there typically is, in any reference to nonviolence, additional imagery or phrasing that positively reinforces nonviolence. When he references violence, he uses negative imagery or negative phrasing. So you'll see nonviolence is always getting built up. Nonviolence more powerful than violence, right? There's literally a way where he's elevating the stature of nonviolence. You also have a little blip there where it says, our conviction is that human life is a very special possession given by God to man and that no one has the right to take it for any reason or any cause, however just it may be. If you did not realize that that had similar word choice to the Declaration of Independence, you could say it's an allusion, but it's certainly the word choice, how he phrased it, making this an inalienable human right, is meant to bolster how important the movement is. Some of you may have called that logos, but it's a bit of a stretch. I think it's not as strong as a logos example as it is a word choice example. The phrasing here is so precise that it mimics such an important document. You have some logos just a little bit down on the page. You'll notice my note says some logos, but this builds off Martin Luther King and provides credentials for his, being Chavez's, argument. So some of you might have said the bottom part of that first page had logos in it, like if we do this, then this. if-then arguments are somewhat logical. Therefore, they could look like logos. But really, logos is more obsessed with hard fact. Not that you can't have logical argument written down, but that's actually it's funny to me because it's kind of a pun. No pun intended. It's a slippery slope. So instead of trying to make sure that the phrasing is always fully logical, if you're not seeing hard evidence, potentially avoid using logos. I'm going to pause this on the first part because I'm getting notification that I have to go help out with something, but I'll be right back.